welcome back to Fans of Fandom. I'm your host, Dr. Eric Wesselmann, psychologist, professor, and full-time nerd. On this show, I have deep dive conversations with cool people about things we're fans of. If you're joining us, chances are you're a fan too. Welcome aboard. So for this series, The Dark Ages of DC, please welcome back my co-host, Mr. Victor Dandridge.
Hello.
Victor, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Yes, I am self-publishing comic creator Victor Dandridge, lovingly called the hardest working man in comics. I'm a phenomenological narratologist who teaches the philosophy of storytelling through my You Create Comics line. And if I'm not doing that, I'm writing amazing new stories through my Vantage In-House Productions creator-owned imprint. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, obviously, Death of Superman, if you guys have followed the series so far, you know, we have a lot of thoughts on that. And it's a huge piece of my comic book history. So I'm super glad to be back talking with you, Eric. Can't wait.
Excellent. Well, let's dive right back in. We just finished talking about the death issue itself,
Yes.
But before we get to the funeral, and I know you're chomping at the bit, everybody, we want to talk a little bit about the immediate aftermath before even getting to the next day, so to speak, or the next minutes of the story. The story just itself kept going. So that's what we're going to talk about now, is the aftermath marketing. So for the first two Wizard issues that followed the death, right, Wizard magazine, they continued hyping the issue because, you know, they didn't just do the direct-to-market edition,
right,
Tombstone edition, or the newsstand. There were second printings,
yes,
third printings, fourth printings, going on even into March and April of 1993. Like, they just kept printing because
that's right.
it was
That's
so
right.
high. So in the January and February issues of Wizard magazine, we had a variety of different promos. First and foremost, in the bag, because at this point in time, everything was polybagged, right? Wizard had been polybagging their stuff for a while, in addition to regular comics. And the argument, as we'll unwrap, for the polybag was largely to hold in the free stuff. Right? So there were a lot of posters. Trading cards were big, as we talked about last time, and here was the promo for Death of Superman's trading cards. Wow. It was a different one than what came in the 75 polybag, right? That was the sort of Tombstone facsimile. This was the bleeding symbol. And you can see right there on the back that it's like, hey, this is the prototype. Is the 000 number.
Love it.
And then in the February issue, so there was the only thing in the January issue was the cards. There was nothing in the actual internal content of the magazine that had to do with the death. Number 18, February, we had a particular story here talking about, hey, now it's the best-selling non-premiere comic of all time. Already started talking.
We do have to talk about that too, because that distinction is very important. Non-premiere being the terminology, because what we find in comics is that number one issues spike sales because of the aftermath of events like this, where because it's the first time, people assume that there's going to be a huge value to it. So the idea of literally this being something that spiked sales across the industry and needing to specify that it is still unto itself different because it wasn't a premiere series, not a first issue at all. It was an actual series piece. That makes that very important. So I just want to throw that out there as comic book references.
Right, because up to this point in time, you know, the title holder, and it still might be the title holder,
is X-Men #1.
X-Men #1.
That's right.
The 1991 reboot of the series. Yep. So, but that was still a #1.
Exactly.
You know, so they have this story here, and they're sort of like, hey, this is popular. Here are the issue numbers, just in case you didn't get them. You know, they note here, and can you see my cursor on the screen moving?
Yep.
Yeah. We got the trade paperback, so we'll talk more about the trade in a second, right? That was starting to come out. They were hyping that. And then, we have down here, in addition to the sequel, they're going to be re-releasing second printing for Justice League #70, which was the Funeral for a Friend tie-in, right? Because in the original series, we had Justice League America 69 as the tie-in to the Doomsday story.
Right.
You know, I love how they say there will be no reprint of the polybagged 75.
I mean, truth be told, that was definitely a smart statement when it comes to the aftermarket value push, to say after it's been out there, right? They've invested this amount of money into creating these things. And to be fair, even still, like, it is going to be a little bit more of an expense to create a polybag version of any single issue. Like, that's an investment. So to make a public announcement, there will never be another reprinting of it. The ideal is that the value skyrockets. And the thing that makes it so incredible, because again, one of the things we talked about before was the way that DC as a publisher funneled into interest and intent through retailers. This was another thing that was a welcome piece, because now it meant that retailers were allowed to actively up the margins and profitability on these sale items, because now it's a limited edition and there's not going to be any more. So this announcement actually is a functional push to go to retail and find these things, because that's where it's actually now more valuable to them. So this is one of those things where a lot of times creators sense don't necessarily understand that you can actually up the ante of a product by either stating that it won't be reprinted, or calling it a limited edition something or other, or producing specifically a limited edition version, and allowing the secondary market, the retailer market, to profit specifically off of that. You will make the best of friends out of retailers, and that functions later on, where if you come out with something else, they're more apt to jump on board because of the potential growth of profitability therein. So that is huge as a statement from a marketing standpoint. Literally smart.
Yeah, this making clear, as you said, limited edition, right? This idea that it's scarce, and, you know, for better or for worse, a sort of pan-cultural human motivation is to say, if something is scarce, I want it.
You're missing out. That FOMO is real. That is a sales tactic. It has been forever. Like, that's it.
It's valuable. I must have it because I can't, and I can't get it if I don't get it now.
Exactly.
Right? Only 3 left in stock.
You know what? I don't want to out anybody. I don't want to out anybody specifically, but I have been in conventions where a person with a plethora of artwork, prints and things like that, if someone shows interest, they will purposefully tell them that they don't have many of them left, despite the fact that the show might have just opened up or they've got all kinds of restock, but they'll tell them that there's not that many left to instigate the sale right then and there. So it is a actual natural phenomenon.
And what does that mean? There aren't many left. When I say, am I saying 20? Am I saying 2,000? I've got 1,000. There's not many left.
Many, right? You know, I've already went through half my stock. Oh my God, I gotta get that. There's 2 million of these things, but whatever. Like, that's secondary. Okay, those are secondary story beats that, you know, listen to the story I'm telling you. I don't have that many left. You know, AKA I don't have an infinite amount. That's all I'm telling you.
Exactly. I'm not lying.
I'm not lying.
In this same issue, there was another plug to tie into the death of Superman. And I love this. So every month Wizard did a contest, usually with what was hot. And what struck me about this particular one was, you know, of course, you've got that Tombstone iconic artwork again. So we've got the Tombstone, the bloody S shield or the weeping S shield, and the tattered cape flag, right? In this case, they're highlighting the Tombstone. And the first prize, of course, is the full set of Death of Superman, or one set of Death of Robin, your choice, right? And so we talked about this before, that, you know, the previous sort of major death gimmick was Robin, and he stayed dead at this point in time. You know, Jason Todd had not come back yet. But then you go further down, and they have the death of Captain Marvel, which we've referenced, another death that was permanent at the time and still has stayed permanent. And so they're sort of riffing on all these different
That's
death
awesome.
things. Then I sort of zoomed in down there at the name of the contest. And most of the time it was just, contest number 5 or whatever. But here they actually called it Morbid. I just love that.
Because they knew this was a really dark sort of measure. But I think that there is something very interesting with what they're showing. The sort of sandwiching of long-standing deaths is something that has to be addressed here, because with their order, you've got Superman, who has just died. Okay, so the idea of whether or not he's coming back, they're almost kind of instigating a little further by putting in these other instances of folks who either had recently died within the last 10 years, but had not come back, and then one that had died and did come back. So we've got, Robin at the time had not, right? So Death of the Family had come out, Jason Todd voted to die, had not come back. We actually had a new Robin kind of instilled shortly around this time that this happened. So Tim Drake becomes Robin shortly before the death of Superman. So any showcase of Robin that you see in correlation to Funeral for a Friend or anything like that is not Jason Todd. It is the new Robin, Tim Drake. So that is a huge statement of the potential permanence of Superman's death. Then you go into Captain Marvel, right? Captain Marvel had been dead, died of cancer, had not come back, right? The mantle of Captain Marvel was picked up by Monica Rambeau, who, was Captain Marvel before she became Photon, before she became Spectrum. This is long before Carol Danvers adopted that same moniker. She was Ms. Marvel at the time, which kind of lets you know, like, in terms of a sense of popularity, Monica being Captain Marvel before Carol, that's how prominent of a character she was. So anyone that's watching the upcoming Captain Marvel series and they're like, oh, they're just changing stuff, I need y'all to read some books, okay? Go back and read some books. That's important. But the one person that they have on here who had died and had come back would be the Phoenix. So Jean Grey was the one on the list here who had died, had come back. As we clearly talked about, X-Men #1 being a #1 top-selling single issue of all time, Jean Grey is alive and well in that series. So she had come back by that point, though her death was something very prominent and phenomenal because it was integrated into the story and not necessarily billed at its original creation as the focal point of the story. It was this big adventure, and this is one of the things that happened, but it wasn't necessarily, we're going to tell this story that's the death of the Phoenix. It was just called the Phoenix Saga, and it was the whole range of things that happened with her. But then you go into Crisis. Supergirl died, Flash died, and at the time, neither one of them, the Barry Allen Flash, had returned. Again, Barry's character created a legacy status for Wally West, who was formerly Kid Flash, to take over. So any representation of Flash that was a part of Funeral for a Friend, that's Wally, not Barry, who had been killed almost a full decade before. We're tiptoeing to 10 years of Barry being gone by the time Death of Superman happens. Supergirl, as we understand her, did not return until the early aughts. So again, she was one that was gone for quite a long time. So again, in this comparison of this morbid code number 18 contest, Wizard is purposefully sandwiching this in between big happening deaths in comics where only one of them had ever come back. There's a list of or an essence of permanence that one could definitely assume from this because of how this right here is actually grouping it together. And I think that's pretty big. It's pretty big.
Yeah. I'll allow myself to nerdy out a little bit more and
Let's
ask you
go.
about so Supergirl. How did they bring Kara back?
So the way that they brought Kara back was in a series where it's how do I want to put this? So Kara Zor-El is reintroduced in a series called Superman Batman, written by Jeff Loeb and art by Michael Turner. And it was kind of this new millennial retake where it wasn't really explained in terms of what happened with Crisis. It's almost as though Crisis didn't happen. That's the way they kind of approached it. Like it's a new continuity without any particular launch point. I mean, if you look at maybe oh my goodness, what is that series called? I can see it. There were some time aspects where one of the aspects of I want to say it's Hawk and Dove. I want to say Hawk gets corrupted, becomes a bad guy, and he plays around with time. And maybe that is the catalyst for allowing some of that to adjust. But that happens after the death of Superman, and they still allow for the death of Superman to be something that resonates because Doomsday as a character has still existed. So it's a very soft reboot where they decide, no, we're just going to bring Kara back. And she comes back, and it is pretty much the basis for the animated movie Superman Batman Apocalypse. So much in the same way that movie takes place, where she just kind of shows up as this teenager, and the explanation is that she was sent intending to be the caretaker for Kal-El because she was older than him, but she gets lost along the way, and so her actual pod doesn't arrive until like 30 years after he's been on Earth, but she's in a state a bit of cryostasis, which is supposed to be what happened with him too. That if you really look at the context of time travel through space and things like that, Krypton had been gone for like a very long time, hundreds if not thousands of years by the time he lands on Earth, but he's been in cryostasis, so he doesn't age like he would have, ordinarily. He would have been dead a long time ago, like the planet. So there's different things that they're playing around with, and I think a lot of it has to do with our understanding of continuity as storytellers, our understanding of science and how that applies, as opposed to the comic booky science, which is just like, ooh, radiation, and this is what happens. Like, I think that's kind of where we were getting into a little bit more sophistication with our storytelling and started getting into that. But that's kind of how they brought Kara back, and it wasn't necessarily in any sort of correlation of Crisis. I don't know that there's actually been a story that talks about how there was a version of Supergirl that died, that literally was Superman's cousin that died, and now there's a new one, and it's not that person. If anything, maybe there's been some attempts at retconning through, some of the later Crisis series, Final Crisis, Dark Crisis. Any of those things might hint at it, but only because there was that gaping hole that no one's ever addressed it.
That's really interesting because we talked about Phoenix at the according to the list that we have here. Phoenix is a character that had returned by this point, although technically they could still argue there was no cheating, or well, maybe we could argue that it was cheating, because the Phoenix that died in Phoenix Saga stayed dead, right? Because Jean was in stasis at the bottom of the ocean, right? Now then they could be like, well, but then when the Phoenix did die, that essence came back to Jean and reanimated her, so she's kind of Phoenix and kind of not, and I don't know, whatever. And they did that so that they could, still keep her hero status. Exactly. She is Phoenix, but not the genocidal one.
Right. She's got the Phoenix power, but Phoenix was a totally different entity. Like it just imbued her, or took her form, if you will. It copied her, and that's what it. So like, there's a lot of ways. I mean, this is the magic of comics, where you have people that work really hard to make stories work despite continuity, flaws, errors, traps, paradoxes, any of those things. Because sometimes the thing that matters most is the story you're telling and not the stories that have been told. And it's only in, I would say in the last 30 years that we've become a little bit more dogmatic about, you can't undo this story because this thing says this thing, and now it sets a precedent that you have to follow. I think that's something that's fairly new. And one of the biggest stories that I ever point to that showcases that is the coming of Galactus. In the Fantastic Four, issues 48 through 50, Galactus comes, and it's the Fantastic Four that ward him off. Where are the Avengers? Where are the X-Men? Are you suggesting that the coming of Galactus is such a small, minuscule event that only this little quartet of family members care enough to deal with it. Like, no, this is 100-foot tall guy that's threatening to eat the planet. I think everybody would show up and be like, hey, can we address this, please? But continuity wise, that's not the way they told stories then. So it's not something that I think modern readership audiences would accept. They would be like, no, you can't do that because clearly this has to happen because of this. But at the time, there was a insular essence to the stories, and you could allow for something to just be because that's what it was, and you just accepted it and moved on. So there's an interesting sort of turn that one could argue that, you know, readership was more sophisticated back then because they didn't require everything to be connected. And then you could say the opposite is true, is that we are more sophisticated because we're looking for those connections. And that's, you know, one of those magical things. So yeah, I think that's one of the more interesting pieces of what this Wizard contest does, is it wedges Superman's death in between what were seminal marks of death in comics. And again, only one of them had returned in any capacity at that point. So I think that's a very interesting move in terms of marketability, because then you go, well, if we're talking about it in the same way as these, maybe he is gone. Like, oh my, you know, so very, very interesting.
And we talked about this last episode and probably some of the ones before that, because it's a through line that you have a lot of hardcore comic fans who are like, no, he'll be back. Death is never permanent in comics, where on the one hand, we've just laid out a bunch of folks who were, it's like, well, no, for some of these characters, it kind of was. And it was mostly the mainstream media and, new fans. Were people who just came in just to read the story, were like, oh shit, they really kill him off, right? And this marking once again plays with that ambiguity at every level. And I don't know how much DC had to do with this. I mean, Wizard was kind of its own entity, and so whether or not DC approved the contest or contributed, it's a little unclear.
Very true.
So let's talk a little bit about the trade paperback, right? We've talked about the covers before, you know, how much we love the fact that they combined all this. With this trade paperback, and they did several others as well. Here are just some things that I found looking into the way that it was marketed, things like that. We have here a platinum version that I found online. So this is, I didn't buy this because it was too expensive. This is cover from eBay. But yeah, they made a limited edition even of the trade that you could get, aside from calling it limited and changing some of the coloring on the side, and then the logo. The cover art is largely the same. There was no new front or back matter. It was just calling it limited and changing the color. So pretty good marketing there. It's not even limited number or signed edition.
Right.
So we have also here one of the things that I found in my local, it was Target probably, where I bought my copy of the trade. Not even in an end cap. It was just in the sort of area where they had other comics. We have a bundle here. So a special collector's package for $7.95. So a couple more dollars above the cover price. You could get The Birth and Death of. They reprinted the very first issue of Action Comics.
Right.
And just the Superman story, not all of the ads or the other stories that were contained in that. That was a more recent reprinting, for example. In the last year, they did that, a full facsimile. But this was just that Superman story. You could get that, and you could get, I think, the fourth printing. When I bought this, it was the fourth printing of Superman 75, the newsstand edition.
Wow.
Together.
Can we talk about the rationale and reasoning why there might have been a limited platinum trade paperback edition versus this one? what I want people to really capture is that on this seeming regular edition, I mean, granted, it's a collector's package, so it's got a little bit more stuff in it, which may have been either something that the publisher set up for retailers to have, right? So they gave them the stickers and things like that to put on this to upgrade a regular version of the trade paperback. So that's a key piece right there. Rather than printing this special thing, they just gave you more supply so that you could up the ante. Much in the same way, again, by stating that the poly bags are now limited and we're not producing anymore, gives the opportunity to up value for retailers. Mm-hmm. But I do want to point out that this book at cover price, less than $5. Mm-hmm. And the thing about that is it's not specifically that comics were that cheap. This is part of the era where, at the very least, they're moving into the $1.25, $1.99 era mm-hmm. of books. And the death was at least, what, 6 issues?
Yeah, so officially 6 within the Superman books, but
right.
I still count the JLA.
Yeah, so we'll definitely say 7 with the JLA piece, right? So 7 books, even at $1.25 on the lowest end, if you just did 7 books at $1, right? Which we know that they were more expensive than that, but at $1, this trade out of content, or like based on similar content, should be $7. Mm-hmm. But it's not. The reason why is because at this point in the market, and this will shock people, trade paperbacks were not, they weren't special. They weren't something that was a known commodity in comics. They were barely an asset. This was kind of like an experimental space because they weren't sure if these were going to take off, because there were only a handful of books that had been collected together like this. And that was also kind of the push of what they're saying. You had books like Watchmen. At this time, Dark Knight Returns, seminal works, right? That was the idea, was to take seminal works and make those something special, something, more accessible. From a production standpoint, it is easier to produce multiple copies of a trade paperback than it is 12 different issues of a title, because each issue would require its own plates, its own like cover setup, like each one is its own project. But if I have a set amount, even though it's the same number of pages, but it's one project, and we just run this over and over and over and over again, that becomes cheaper as a publisher for me to manufacture that, which I argue is why we don't see consistent reprints of the individual issues of Watchmen. We will see reprints of the trade paperback all day long, and they've used that as a means to retain the rights to that story. They just reprint the trade because it's actually cheaper to do the trade paperback. And The Death of Superman is probably one of the last versions of that truth. I think if you caught an early trade paperback of Dark Knight Returns, it also is very inexpensive for what you would consider it to be, because the trade paperback was not a celebrated, consorted commodity yet. It was a commodity. I'm sorry, it wasn't an asset. Like, they didn't really know that you could get more value out of having a trade paperback. This was the test. And not only were they testing it like this, I think the limited platinum edition was, can we suggest that there's a different value to it when it's in this collected form? Because there are some people that would consider back in the day, and to a degree even now, a trade paperback is not as valuable as an individual issue. Even though it has the same content, I got the #1 in there, but it's not the #1 issue. It is a reprint of the #1, or, in some way, shape, or form, it is discounted versus the individual issues. So for anyone that sees this and is like, oh my God, you were only paying $5, this is why. Mm-hmm. Today, a trade paperback will be a little bit more reflective of the cost of the individual issues, though there is a slight discount, because the idea is perhaps you've already bought the individual issues, and this is an addendum purchase, not an exclusive separate purchase, which is what it is now. So, there are people now that only buy trade paperbacks because they want the library, set up in their office or in their rooms or what have you. And so now it's an either or. At this point, the trade paperback was an extra that maybe you might want to read the story because you enjoyed the story, but you don't dare risk messing up the individual issue. So the trade paperback was that much cheaper just to give you a read copy versus messing up an individual. So
back and board stuff, right?
Exactly. So even the institution of this still goes right back into the collector speculator's mentality of, well, it was a great story, but we don't want you to ruin your copy that, or 2-3 copies that you've already got. We don't want you to sacrifice those because each one could be valuable. You don't want to demean the value of an individual issue because you want one to read. We'll give you another version that's collected and you can read all of the story on the cheap as long as you've got the other ones that are valuable. That was the purpose.
Another thing that I noticed about these trades, and I don't know how this fits into the broader history of trades because I'm still learning about that, but to sort of riff off of your argument, when looking into the previews of the advanced comics, those trade magazines that were meant to sort of broadcast what was coming, there were collections that were being talked about Superman, but it was collections of all of the really old stuff, with the exception of around this time, Panic in the Sky had been the previous major event, and so they were releasing the trade for that around this time. And one of the things that I thought was interesting is the first ad for the Death of Superman trade came out, during the funeral arc, but it made very clear in there that the ones that they were offering through advance or previews, I can't remember which one, was not a first printing of the trade. They say specifically in there, the trade was rushed out to retailers before they even gave it to these.
Wow. That's incredible.
So they're very clear in there that, what you're going to order from us in this is not the first printings of the trade. It'll be a second or third printing or whatever. And I'm not sure how to distinguish, aside from like what we have here, the limited platinum versus the regular. I don't know if it's said on the cover which printing you got, whereas with a lot of the newsstand editions, like for 75, it'd have a Roman numeral on there.
Well, chances are it said in the indicia, which meant that, like, much in the same way of traditional books, it'll say so in that one page that everybody skips that talks about the publishing input, who the publisher is, where they're based, all that fun stuff. It'll say which printing version it is in that. But what's interesting to me is I wonder if they went as far as I've seen in a few, they changed some of the colors inside the book. There are certain pages that have a certain color set that was also something that they would do to denote first, second, third printing. They would take a page, color it just a little bit differently, so that way you knew, whether it said so or not, that it was a different version of the story. So even in comparison to some of the slides that you've shown before, I've got different iterations based on the books that we've got and we've seen from the slides that you've looked at. So those are subtle ways that they also marked first, second, third, fourth printings by changing a page's color.
I'm going to posit here, based on no direct evidence, but just sort of spinning around with the arguments we've been making. If we assume that, once again, the trades were seen as not something valuable per se, but just a way of collecting that your readers copy, it would, having the changes on the inside, you could figure that out if you just picked it up and flipped through it, right? And then most of these were probably not bagged. Whereas the single issues, you'd have to pick them up and take them out of the bags to be able to tell. Perhaps that's why for single issues, they had the Roman numerals on the cover and a lot of the color changes.
Absolutely.
Because you could be like, all right, well, I don't have to open it to tell. I
don't have to open it. I can see it right here. And this is definitely part of it. I would also wonder if not only was it the idea of wanting the speculator market to thrive by giving a reader copy, but it also could be, and I mean, It doesn't have to be either or, which is the brilliance of this entire marketing campaign. Imagine this. Say it worked in the same way that it did for you, where it wasn't issue 75 that was your first issue. You got the trade paperback. You got the trade paperback for Superman for $5.
Yeah.
That's 7 issues of a story, major story, for $5. But the next time you go back, it's $1.25 per book.
Mm-hmm.
They're gonna recoup what they spent easily. Like, this was a loss leader if you look at it from that standpoint, where, you know, for the already collector minded folks, they were giving them an additional value structure by saying, I know you've already bought top or spent top dollar to get individual versions of this that you're going to save forever and have an expanded value, but we still can give you this book to read, so that way you can tell people how important it is, and the more people that know how important it is, the more valuable your individual issues are. But then those people are coming into comics for the first time. Here's essentially a free comic, or a couple of free comics based on the current value structure, right? So like if they're $1.25 a piece, maybe that's like 4 issues, right? At to $5, you get 4 issues for $5, and then we're going to give you 3 issues for free, based on this value structure. And now you're hooked. You want more of this, and so now you're back at the comic shop every week, spending at least $5 every week. Ta-da! Like, they have built something so smart, so smart. It functions on almost all those levels. And at no point, if you find somebody from either side, could you go, this wouldn't work. It absolutely works, which is, again, why I think Death of Superman is one of the pinnacle marketing pieces in comic. It could never happen again because it was that good.
I'm gonna move us forward a little bit, but before we move conceptually on, the last thing I want to show, just for collector nerds out there, is there's another screenshot of a variant of this packaging that we're talking about. Here's another limited collector set. This one had the Action Comics one. It didn't have a reprinting of 75, but it had a full color wall poster. And I will tell you that it was very hard, the collector in me, even now, to not buy this one too, to be like, oh, I got this version as well.
I just go ahead and snatch that.
Yeah, I still, even now, I'm like, I could spend the extra 20. No, because I can spend that extra 20 on other sort of trade press, which will show up in a future issue. We got to make our decisions. This is one I chose to pass on.
But this is very, very smart. I will take note, again, this leads right into what I was saying again about how this is repackaging of previously printed material. And the way that you know that is the limited collector set piece, that the black with the imagery of Superman flying towards you, that is an insert. The key piece that shows that this is something totally separate is the barcode that is on that. Because the idea is the trade paperback itself would have been printed with a different barcode. So chances are that one in the packaging has that barcode covered up so that you don't ring it up as the traditional regular trade paperback. They inputted this with the barcode on the front so that it could actually function with a totally different price tag than what the original was. So if you open that up, there is a barcode on the back of that trade paperback that is not the same barcode that is on that little packaging sleeve, because that was another way. Because again, if you think about it, if I can just print basically a half sheet of this, like multiple copies of this half sheet, and now you get to add an additional $3 to $15 of value to this thing, how happy would the retailers be to get something like that? Like, it's so smart. Just smart.
Okay. Last little thing I just noticed, maybe last, until I noticed something else. Because I keep talking about this, is it 6, is it 7 parts, right? In the trade press for like previews and advanced comics going into it, they kept calling it, and even Direct Currents, the DC official one, kept calling it the 6 part. And then it was like the one-off JLA. But no, now we look here afterwards. It says on those stickers, 7 part. So
sorry.
anyhow,
that's right.
More evidence, and I'm sticking to it. It's